The subcommittee will come to order. The chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. You want to get that? Turn the clock on.
Is there an on button? Okay.
There we go. In recent years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of drug shortages in the United States, particularly with generic sterile injectable drugs. While the number of new shortages dipped in 2012 and 2013, the total number of ongoing shortages has continued to increase. This is unacceptable. Numerous drugs have remained on FDA's shortage list for some time. What is the agency doing to help address these situations? Recent news reports have highlighted shortages of oncology products, parenteral nutrition products, and even common yet critically important saline solutions. Such shortages lead to delays in treatment, rationing of care, and higher cost. They can also pose greater risk to patients in the form of medication errors, and as providers are forced to seek alternative treatments. Drug shortages are a very challenging problem, and it is clear that there is no simple solution. We recognize the complicated nature of this issue as well as the severity. Last Congress, the subcommittee took action by including a section on drug shortages in the Food and Drug Administration's Safety and Innovation Act, FDASIA, which was signed into law on July 9, 2012. Title 10 of FDASIA sought to address drug shortages by giving new authorities and responsibilities to the Food and Drug Administration and placing expanded requirements on drug manufacturers to notify FDA of an interruption or discontinuance in production. Among other provisions, under FDASIA, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is required to, 1, maintain a publicly available, up-to-date drug shortage list, 2, establish a task force to implement a strategic plan to prevent and mitigate drug shortages, and 3, submit annual reports to Congress, including relating actions taken by the agency. FDASIA has also required GAO to examine the cause of drug shortages and formulate recommendations on how to prevent or alleviate such shortages. Last October, FDA issued its strategic plan for preventing and mitigating drug shortages. Further, we now have FDA's first annual report on drug shortages, though it only covers the first 3 quarters of 2013. And today, GAO released its final report pursuant to FDASIA. While drug shortages continue to plague our healthcare system, statistics do indicate progress on some fronts. I'm pleased to see that legislation coming out of this subcommittee has had a positive impact. I would like to welcome our witnesses, Marcia Cross, Healthcare Director at GAO, and Douglas Throckmorton, Deputy Director of Regulatory Programs at the FDA. I would particularly like to thank GAO for their comprehensive report and the time they have spent with my staff on this issue. I'll yield the remainder of my time to Vice Chair Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when doctors don't have the essential tools, they're restricted in what they can do for their patients. Members of this committee have taken the lead and made major strides in working to reduce drug shortages by passing the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act of 2012. In addition, I have worked very closely with Chairman Upton and Chairman Pitts on several of the provisions contained therein, and things have gotten better, but the problems have not completely gone away. As recently as last week, the Food and Drug Administration listed sodium chloride injection bags as a drug shortage. Now, sodium chloride is not a particularly esoteric or exotic molecule, so for having that much trouble with salt, it only makes you wonder what other more difficult molecules the shortages that we may encounter there. The Food and Drug Administration has a role in addressing drug shortages, but it is a complex issue. In 2010, over 240 drugs were in short supply or unavailable, and more than 400 generic equivalents were back-ordered. In fact, many generic lines operate at margins so tight that when production becomes corrupted, the company simply cannot afford to continue its manufacture. This inevitably leads to one of the more than 3,000 backlogs of generic applications. Physicians are still faced with having to tell patients that they can't receive the care they need, not because there is no treatment, but because a product is simply not available. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing so we can learn more about the progress that is being made on the nation's drug shortage problem. I am pleased that the General Accountability Office report is being released and look forward to hearing from them on their findings. The law is aimed to ensure that providers have the tools they need to alleviate suffering, the suffering of every patient, and certainly I'm anxious to hear the testimony today. I yield back to the chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now yields 5 minutes for opening statement to Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. I'm glad we're having the hearing today on this critical issue of drug shortages. Over the past several years, we saw an alarming trend of increases in drug shortages, and we all know the devastating effects this can have on patients, potentially prolonging disease or causing permanent disability or even death. This is an issue I and many of my colleagues on the committee have long been concerned about. Congress took action to provide the Food and Drug Administration with tools to help address this problem through provisions in the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, or FDASIA, which passed on a strong bipartisan basis in the summer of 2012. In FDASIA, we asked the Government Accountability Office to review several factors related to drug shortages, updating work it had done previously, and they released that report today, and I'm glad Dr. Cross is here to discuss it further with us. I also want to take a moment to highlight some of the other aspects in FDASIA that address the drug shortage problem. In its 2011 report on drug shortages, the GAO recommended, and we heard this from other stakeholders too, an early notification requirement for potential shortages so that FDA can work with manufacturers sooner to take steps to prevent or mitigate shortages. We included such a requirement in FDASIA, and it's encouraging that the number of new drug shortages declined in 2012 compared to the previous 2 years, and that partial data from 2013 indicates that the trend is continuing. The FDA has cited this and other FDASIA drug shortage provisions as contributing to their ability to prevent, by their calculation, 140 drug shortages in the first 3 quarters of 2013. We also heard from stakeholders the need for faster review times for generic drug applications and to reduce the significant backlog of pending applications, and the generic user fee agreement that was passed as part of FDASIA was important in getting FDA the resources it needs to make that happen. We've learned that it can be important to have multiple manufacturers, especially for the most medically important drugs, to help alleviate drug shortages. As we heard from FDA a few months ago, the agency has been aggressively hiring FTEs for its generic drug program, meeting hiring goals in the law as part of its efforts to tackle the backlog and speed up review times. And these are just some of the steps that have been taken to address drug shortages, which is, of course, a complex problem. As I'm sure we will hear today from our witnesses, drug shortages remain high and remain a problem. Many of the shortages are still of sterile injectable drugs, and I'm aware that these types of drugs face unique challenges because they're technically difficult to manufacture, and each drug is often manufactured by one or a small number of companies, making it difficult for other companies to be able to fill the need if any one company develops manufacturing problems. So it's clear that while we have made progress in some areas, our work is not over. I thank our witnesses from FDA and GAO for being here today to continue our discussion on the topic of drug shortages, and I look forward to learning more about what we can do to further prevent them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
This time, Chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn. 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome our witnesses. I thank you all for being here, and I thank the Chairman and the Vice Chairman of the committee for their attention to this issue. As you all know, 2011, 2012, we held hearings. We have looked at this process and what the factors are that are causing the drug shortages, and we know that they've increased in recent years, and I'm one of those. I believe let's get to the root cause and to the root problem so that we are solving this. And I continue to talk with those health professionals in the community in Tennessee and get their input on this. We did take a bipartisan action, as the chairman and the ranking member have mentioned, and that was to address through FDASIA the shortages, and FDASIA did provide FDA with the authority that they needed. It put new requirements on the manufacturers to help prevent and to mitigate the shortages, or supposedly on paper, that's what they're to do. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to look at the GAO report, to question you, to hear from you, and to continue to try to look at this systemically, holistically, and to get to the root causes of solving this problem. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you for further yielding.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. That concludes the panel's, our members' opening statements. On the panel today, we have two witnesses, Dr. Marcia Cross, Director, Healthcare U.S. Government Accountability Office, and Dr. Doug Throckmorton, Deputy Director for Regulatory Programs, Center for Drug Evaluation Research, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for coming. Your written testimony will be made part of the record. You'll have 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement. And at this time, the Chair recognizes Dr. Cross for 5 minutes for her summary.
Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss our work on drug shortages. As you know, prescription drugs are a critical part of medical care. But over the last decade, there's been an increase in the number of drugs that are in shortage. This has included drugs to stabilize trauma victims, to control pain during surgery, to treat heart disease and cancer, and to provide nutritional support to premature infants. Today, GAO released our report on drug shortages, a study you mandated in the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, and I'm happy to discuss our key findings. We found that the number of drug shortages remains high, and that providers experience challenges responding to shortages without adversely affecting patient care. Beginning in 2007, the number of new drug shortages increased each year until 2012, when the number of new shortages declined, and that downward trend appears to have continued through 2013 based on the partial year data we analyzed. However, while the number of new drug shortages has begun to decline, the total number of shortages active during a given year, including both new shortages and ongoing shortages that began in a prior year, has continued to increase because many shortages are prolonged, with some spanning multiple years. The majority of shortages are of sterile injectable drugs, particularly generics. Shortages of medically necessary drugs can have a range of negative effects. A drug shortage may require providers to delay or ration care, create difficulties finding alternative drugs, increase the risk of medication errors, lead to higher costs, reduce time for patient care, and result in the hoarding or stockpiling of drugs in shortage. For example, providers may have to ration care by prioritizing the patients who have a greater need for the drug. The immediate cause of a drug shortage can generally be traced to a manufacturer halting or slowing production to address quality problems, triggering a supply disruption. Other manufacturers have a limited ability to respond to supply disruptions due to constrained manufacturing capacity. We also identified potential underlying causes specific to the economics of the generic sterile injectable drug market, such as that low profit margins have limited infrastructure investments or led some manufacturers to exit the market. Although there are few studies of underlying causes, among the issues that have been examined are that purchasers focus primarily on price rather than quality, reducing incentives for manufacturers to invest in maintenance or quality improvements. That group purchasing organizations negotiate reduced drug prices on behalf of hospitals and other providers, lowering profit margins for manufacturers that win contracts and leading losing manufacturers to exit the market. And that a 2005 change in Medicare Part B drug reimbursement policy for outpatient providers decreased both demand and prices for generic drugs. The stakeholders we met with, which included manufacturers and group purchasing organizations, had mixed views on these potential underlying causes, with no general agreement on the role such factors may play. In examining FDA activities, we found that the agency has prevented more potential shortages and improved its ability to respond to shortages in the last 2 years. The new requirement that manufacturers must notify FDA in advance of a potential shortage has allowed FDA to take steps to prevent and mitigate shortages sooner. For example, it has expedited application reviews and inspections, exercised enforcement discretion, and helped manufacturers respond to quality problems. These steps are important to respond to some of the immediate causes of shortages. However, some of the underlying causes we identified are beyond the agency's authority, as FDA does not have control over private companies' business decisions. For example, the agency is unable to require manufacturers to start producing or continue producing drugs, or to build redundant manufacturing capacity, regardless of the severity of a shortage. Nonetheless, FDA can take steps to maximize the agency's use of the information it has to address drug shortages. We identified shortcomings in its management and use of the agency's drug shortage data. In our report, we made recommendations to FDA to improve its database and to conduct routine analyses, and the agency has agreed with these recommendations. In summary, while FDA has made progress in preventing potential drug shortages and responding to actual shortages, the number of shortages remains high and many persist for months and even years. The large number of potential shortages reported to the agency suggests the market is still at risk of supply disruptions. As a result, patients and providers will continue to struggle as essential and life-saving medications remain in short supply. Mr. Chairman, this completes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to respond to any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes Dr. Throckmorton 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Douglas Throckmorton, Deputy Director of FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the work FDA is doing to address drug shortages. I'd like to begin by discussing their causes. Drug shortages, as others have said, are usually preceded by a disruption in manufacturing of a product. Some product disruptions are manufacturer-controlled, such as decisions to permanently discontinue production of a drug that's no longer profitable. Other factors are outside the manufacturer's control, such as natural disasters or the unavailability of materials needed for manufacturing, a particular problem when materials are only available from one supplier. Most often, however, shortages are the result of quality failures within manufacturing facilities, such as failing to follow proper sterilization procedures that allow bacteria to grow in a sterile product. Quality failures can also result from failures to maintain a manufacturing line. For example, poorly maintained old equipment has led to the introduction of iron particulates in injectable products. Preventing these supply disruptions requires the manufacturer to commit to quality manufacturing. Turning to drug shortages in the U.S. today, while work remains, progress has been made in the prevention and resolution of drug shortages in the United States. The agency is well positioned to work with manufacturers to find ways to prevent or reduce a shortage's impact on patients, provided we are aware that there is the potential for a shortage. Early and timely notification by manufacturers has been aided importantly by the executive order of the President as well as by passage of FDASIA, and has enabled FDA and manufacturers to prevent 170 shortages in 2013. We are also seeing fewer new shortages. The number of new drug shortages in the United States rose steadily from 60 in 2005 to an all-time high of in 2011 of 251 new shortages. After a series of interventions, the number of new drug shortages has fallen to a low of 44 in 2013. There do, however, continue to be shortages that persist for longer periods. Here, while progress is being made, the FDA is tracking and working to resolve 97 total shortages that began in 2013 or earlier. This work has been accomplished by FDA working closely with manufacturers, and some of the tools we have applied include identifying manufacturers who are willing and able to increase production of a drug in shortage, expediting FDA inspections and reviews of submissions, both from manufacturers that are currently producing as well as manufacturers who are interested in starting new production of a drug in shortage, And finally, exploring risk mitigation measures for products initially not meeting established standards to allow them to remain available safely. While FDA standards for safety, efficacy, and quality do not change in a shortage situation, FDA does balance our standards with the needs of patients for particular products, especially patients with limited treatment options. FDA makes certain that drug shortages are considered before taking enforcement actions or issuing warning letters. In appropriate cases, temporary exercise of regulatory flexibility is an important tool in ensuring access to needed drugs. As a part of FDA's work on drug shortages in 2013, the FDA released its strategic plan, as called for in FDASIA. The goals of the plan are to improve the agency's response to drug shortages and advance longer-term approaches for addressing the underlying causes of shortage. First, to improve how we address imminent or existing shortages, FDA is focusing in 3 areas. First, we are improving communications within CDER, within the FDA, to ensure that our decisions are efficient and appropriate. Second, we are improving our databases related to drug shortages, creating a dedicated drug shortage data system to improve how we track drug shortages and allow us to better assess progress on prevention and mitigation of those shortages, including the work we do to produce the annual report to Congress required under FDASIA. Third, FDA continues to work to improve timely and accurate communication about drug shortages to patients and caregivers. Recognizing that drug shortages commonly begin with the supply disruption related to product quality, FDA's long-range efforts include a focus on preventing supply disruptions and shortages by encouraging and sustaining improvements in manufacturing quality. For over a decade, FDA has been working with academics and industry experts to stimulate the development of novel manufacturing technologies which can help prevent drug shortages linked to manufacturing quality. In conclusion, progress has been made in efforts to prevent and mitigate important drug shortages, aided by early communications with sponsors about potential shortages. Shortages do continue to occur. FDA will continue to work to address them. Importantly, FDA will continue to work with others to support the pharmaceutical industry in their long-term efforts to modernize drug manufacturing to prevent shortages. By working together, we can prevent drug shortages from occurring, address them when they do occur, and provide patients with access to medicines when they are in critical need. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. That concludes the opening statements of the panel. We'll now begin questioning, and I will recognize myself for that purpose for 5 minutes. Dr. Throckmorton, while FDASIA required that the report be submitted by no later than December 31st, 2013, FDA's first annual shortages report was submitted to the committee on February the 5th, and with data from only the first 3 quarters of 2013. You notice in your testimony that 170 new shortages were prevented in 2013. This is up from 140 in the report FDA submitted to the Congress. I assume that means that FDA claims to have prevented 30 shortages in the 4th quarter of the year. Is that correct?
We do have our full year data available now, and we'd be happy to share that with you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, let's use that smaller sample size for sake of discussion. It'd be helpful to have more detailed information about how FDA prevented these shortages. What specific actions did the agency take? Which drug products would currently be in shortage if not for the agency's actions?
I can get you some specific information, but I can give you a general sense of some of the activities that we took in this last year, if that would be helpful.
All right.
One issue regards something called regulatory flexibility. So these are places where we've either expedited additional actions that otherwise would have taken a bit longer, or taken a review and underhand and done additional work on it. In last year, we had 76 instances of regulatory flexibility that we exercised, affecting a total of 68 products. There's another way of thinking about the actions that we've taken recently to try to speed the development of products or assure that products that potentially go into shortage remain available. That's by looking at the kinds of expedited reviews that my review staff do. So several of the offices receive applications from sponsors for new factories, for new for new lines within a factory. Last year, my Office of Generic Drugs expedited 118 applications involving a total of 62 accelerated new drug applications. So an important number of products where we worked hard to make certain that they were more quickly reviewed than normal. Our Office of New Drug Quality, which is another office looking at supplemental applications to approved drugs, approved innovator drugs, looked at 52 supplemental applications in an expedited form last year. And then finally, my Office of Biologic Products, which looks at new biologic products, obviously a very important issue in terms of therapeutics and therapeutic development. They expedited 7 reviews last year. I think, so in total, those things reflect the kind of commitment that my center has to looking at these things, expediting wherever we're able to devote our resources to do it.
Okay, now you mentioned the Office of Generic Drug expedited 118 applications, including 62 abbreviated new drug applications, ANDAs, as you call them.
Yes.
In order to prevent or mitigate a shortage, how many of those applications were actually approved?
You know, I'd need to get back with you about that information. Obviously, we're applying our usual standards, but 118 applications, I think, speaks to the level of effort that we undertook. On
average, how long did it take FDA to approve an ANDA that was given expedited review status? Do you know?
It's a good question, and I will get back with you with that information.
Okay, and I'd like to know more about what expedited review means in this situation. Does an ANDA referencing a product in shortage go to the top of the queue? Is there a special team within the Office of Generic Drugs responsible for moving them through the review process faster?
This will be a longer conversation. As I'm sure you're aware, we have new resources under GDUFA, under the Generic Drugs User Fee Act. As a part of those resources, we've reorganized the Office of Generic Drugs. We're elevating it in terms of its importance within the Center for Drugs. And as a part of that action, we're looking to be as efficient as we possibly can. So to answer your question, I'm going to need to get back and look at the kinds of changes that office has made about their review staff.
All right, Dr. Cross, did you have any discussions with FDA review staff about what it means for a shortage product to receive expedited review status within OGD?
We did talk with FDA about this. We actually are continuing our work looking at drug shortages, where we're planning on taking a more in-depth review of the number of drug shortages that have been expedited and how that relates to the number of applications that are sitting in the queue for drugs that are in shortage. One issue, of course, is that even when you expedite an application, if it is approved, that doesn't mean that the manufacturer is ready to begin production that day. And there is some concern that approving one ANDA may displace another drug within that manufacturer's facility if you're trying to move very quickly to move something to the top of the line without the sort of normal planning time. So that is something we heard about, but we are looking further to try to get some statistics for you on how frequently FDA is moving on these applications and what proportion of the applications are getting moved on.
Yeah, and I would also be interested in how FDA works with the manufacturer to address their targets, to assess when production capacity and output has addressed the shortage. My time's expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start with Dr. Throckmorton. I'd like to know how helpful you're finding the drug shortage provisions in FDASIA, and whether there are other things you think Congress should do to help address drug shortages. And I'd also like to hear more about FDA's strategic plan for preventing and mitigating drug shortages. I was pleased to see that it was released last October in fulfillment of one of your FDASIA obligations. So essentially 3 questions. Would you update us on how things stand today with regard to drug shortages and the agency's plan to address them? And now that FDA has some experience with FDASIA, are there parts of the law that don't work as intended or, you know, as well as they should? And then third, are there other areas we should be thinking about to help address the shortages?
Thank you. So first, let me just say the provision of FDASIA that expanded the notification that manufacturers have been providing for us has been enormously helpful. It's hard for me to overstate that. We are learning about shortages earlier than we had previously, and it's giving us the opportunity to talk with manufacturers in ways that we hadn't had an opportunity to before, and we've been able to prevent shortages as a result. So unquestionably, that aspect of FDASIA has been useful from the FDA's perspective. We continue to make use of it. As you know, we're continuing to write rulemaking and things are related to it, but it is fundamentally a valuable aspect of the work that we're doing that's very useful. The other aspects of FDASIA, I think, have also been useful for us as well. The requirement to produce an annual report, I think, is valuable because it does give us an opportunity on an annual basis to look back and assess whether there are things that we need to continue to work on or where progress has been made. That's a piece that we were able to provide to you recently for 3/4 of the year's data. We obviously need to update you with the full year data because we think that gives us a fuller picture of the activities that the FDA has conducted. And so fundamentally, FDASIA has been valuable to us from a shortage prevention strategy. Now, you asked us whether additional things were identified in the strategic plan that needed also to be done, and the short answer is yes. So there are many things that we can do internally. There are things that we need to do from a process perspective to make sure that the FDA continues to improve our responses to the drug shortages issue, and that those relate, many of them, to process. So I chair the task force that's been steering our response to drug shortages since FDASIA's passage. That task force is made up of individuals from across the agency, so not just simply my center, but also the Center for Biologics, the inspectional branch of the FDA. All of us are coming together to talk about the things we need to do, the things that we need to communicate about better, to be able to basically do the job more efficiently and more appropriately. We also recognize we need to improve our communications. The communications we place on the website are looked at hundreds of thousands of times by individuals looking for information about shortages. We heard loud and clear when we talked to our stakeholders that needed to be improved so that the information was easier to find, so that topical information was easier to identify, that the normal saline shortage, for instance, was at the top of the queue when you opened up that web page, that you could get that information quickly. We've heard those kinds of comments, and we're doing what we can to improve those communications. Separately, however, there are things that are, as Dr. Cross said, outside of our scope, outside of the things that the FDA is able to undertake. There are things that the manufacturers, we believe, have a role to explore. And there are other things that other stakeholders could explore as well that have great potential, I believe, in addressing the underlying causes of shortage.
Right.
Happy to talk with you about those if you're interested.
All right, let me just get into one more question because my time's almost gone here. One of the GAO's recommendations is that FDA conduct routine analysis of its drug shortage database to identify trends, and that seems like a reasonable suggestion. It seems like FDA already does this to some extent, but perhaps not in as formalized a process as the GAO. Can you just tell us a little more on the problems with the current FDA databases and what you hope the improvements will accomplish? And does FDA believe that performing analysis such as GAO recommends would help it come up with recommendations for avoiding shortages? I got like 15 seconds.
Fundamentally, we agree with the recommendations that the GAO has made. We understand that the quality of the decision-making that we can have with regards to shortage depends on the quality of the data. So we're putting in place a new drug shortage data system that's going to make the data more robust, make it more standardized, and improve our assessment of those data.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank each of you for being here with us. I've got just a couple of questions. I know that the FDA report said, the number of reported new shortages has declined in 2012 and for the first 3 quarters of 2013. But then GAO says the total number of active shortages continues to be high. So do you each agree with that? Dr. Cross?
Yes, we do agree. The number of new shortages has decreased, and we think that the FDASIA early notification has been very helpful in that regard. But a number of shortages have persisted across time.
Okay.
I think we present that information in our report.
Yes, you do. Dr. Throckmorton, do you agree with that the shortages continue to be too high?
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay. Just want to be sure everybody is in complete agreement on that, because what I am hearing from the providers in Tennessee, they agree with the GAO report, and Dr. Throckmorton, they look at yours and it's kind of a head scratcher because they're not seeing the amount of improvement that your report would lead people to believe is there. And we continue to hear about the shortages with the generic sterile injectable drugs, the IV fluids, the medications for anesthesia, some of the cancer therapies. So these are problems, and you might be making some progress, but it is not coming fast enough. And so let's talk about FDA implementing the system and getting to the point that they can prevent new shortages and decrease the backlog of the current shortages. So, Ms. Cross, give me the couple of things that we need to be holding them responsible for doing. What is going to speed this up? Because we can't do this where we're saying 10 years from now we're going to have this in place.
Well, we do continue to look at some of the underlying causes. I think we need to look a little more closely at those generic drug applications that are sitting at FDA and the extent to which FDA has been able to expedite the applications, which could be something that would help. But
okay,
there are still a number of...
If I can engage you right there for just
Sure.
a minute. So, Dr. Throckmorton, you said you expedited 118 this year.
generic applications. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Cross, what would be a better number? What if you were setting a goal for him? How many should they be expediting every year? 200?
I don't know.
You don't know.
I don't know, and I think there is a concern that if you expedite too many, then you're creating a clog at the top.
Okay.
It's difficult. You need, there even within the priorities,
As you said,
there are
it
priorities.
may be approved, but then they can't put it straight into manufacturing.
Right. So there needs to be conversations with the manufacturers about how quickly they could come
Okay.
online.
So they need to be engaging them on the front end rather than the back end.
Yes.
Or at the point of approval. Would predictability in this process with the review system, because as I talk to some that are working in the generic space, the biotherapeutic space, the unpredictability at the FDA seems to be a problem. Dr. Cross, would that help?
That's not something that we heard from the manufacturers
Okay.
particularly. I think that, certainly that's always an issue in any review process for
Yeah, it's
the
expensive.
applications, but it's not something that they particularly pointed to here because of the unpredictability of when a shortage might occur.
Okay. Dr. Throckmorton?
I want to try to draw a distinction between the numbers of ongoing shortages, those that last extended periods of time, which are important, and that's one group of shortages that I think we know less about than we need to. I think that's a group that bears additional exploration, and the numbers of new shortages and the numbers of new shortages prevented. So when I answered your question that there are too many shortages, there are too many shortages because there are shortages that have impact on human access to drugs in the U.S. I mean, we would have to do away with those before there would not be too many shortages. Having said that, however, I think we have to acknowledge that there has been work that's been important that has been able to prevent new shortages from adding onto that pile, if you were. We are able to prevent shortages that matter. Our next important task, a task that I think we need to undertake, is understand those longer duration shortages, those shortages that mean no product is in the marketplace at all. There's no manufacturer willing and interested in manufacturing
My
the
time
product.
has expired. I thank you for that additional explanation. Mr. Chairman, as I yield back to you, I do want to take a moment and wish happy birthday to Congressman Guthrie. Yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady, and well, wishes Mr. Guthrie a happy birthday. At this time, Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Dinkle, 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy and for holding this important hearing. I'm pleased that the committee is turning again to the important topic of drug shortages. There are many causes for this: the availability of raw materials, complexity of manufacturing certain treatments, sudden increases in demand. We've also got a significant problem in adequate funding for FDA and an adequate number of personnel to properly address the business of that agency. While we've made some progress in this area, such as the passage of FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which improved communication and reporting of drug shortages, we all agree, I think, that there's more work to be done. So I hope our witnesses will answer the questions yes or no. Dr. Throckmorton, the last time this committee held a hearing on drug shortages, the situation was dire. Is it correct that the number of new drug shortages quadrupled from 2005 to 2011? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, doctor, is it correct that there are only 44 new drug shortages in 2013 compared with 117 during the year 2012? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, doctor, is it correct that FDA successfully prevented 170 drug shortages in 2013? Yes or no?
Working with manufacturers, yes.
Now, Dr. Cross, although GAO used slightly different metrics, did your agency also find a decrease in new drug shortages during 2012? Yes or no?
Yes.
Dr. Throckmorton, did the new authorities provided to the agency and FDA SIA help FDA to reduce the number of new drug shortages? Yes or no?
Yes.
Would you submit for the record additional changes that need to be made to further reduce the delays and the shortages when they occur?
Yes.
I also would like to know, would more personnel and more money assist FDA in terms of addressing these questions?
We're devoting the resources we need to this problem.
And so, Doctor, would you submit us a short monograph on that to
Yes.
assist the committee? Dr. Throckmorton, does FDA need additional authorities to help combat both existing and future drug shortages? Yes or no?
Existing authorities are providing us important tools.
Would you please submit a detailed response to the record, including the resources needed by the agency?
Yes.
Dr. Cross, GAO's report on drug shortages makes 2 recommendations to FDA. Specifically, you recommend that the agency use its drug shortage database in a more proactive manner to identify trends and patterns to help prevent shortages before they occur. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Throckmorton, does FDA agree with this recommendation?
Yes.
Would you please both submit a detailed response for the record regarding how FDA could use this database more proactively and whether you need more resources to implement the recommendation?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, I am pleased with the progress made in preventing drug shortages since the passage of FDA SIA. We need to take a step back and look at the big picture. Fundamentally, drugs are in a shortage because we simply aren't making enough of them. As you know, many current shortages are of generic, sterile, injectable drugs. Dr. Throckmorton, does FDA believe there are sufficient incentives to enter this market today, or are more needed?
Important question I can't answer without a fuller discussion with more other stakeholders.
Would you submit a proper analysis then in a response to this?
Yes.
Now, I think it's time to start thinking outside the box about how we can continue to make progress on preventing these drug shortages and combating existing shortages. We need new and innovative ideas to help solve the problem, as well as cooperation from all stakeholders. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the committee the FDA and all stakeholders on this critical issue of moving forward. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks, gentlemen. Now yields 5 minutes to the Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Throckmorton, we had the executive order from October of 2011, and then, of course, Food and Drug reauthorization in July of 2012. But for the casual observer to this problem of drug shortages, can you kind of just give us a thumbnail of what's being done to deal with the existing drug shortages?
We have a number of things. First off, I would say existing drug shortages, especially those that have lasted for a prolonged period of time, are hard. They're hard to resolve because the factors that have led to them have meant manufacturers have left that space entirely. So resolving those is going to require finding tools to encourage a new manufacturer to decide to add a product to a manufacturing line, make a decision that that's a product that they can make a profit at, decide to design that line and get approvals and things. So that those long-term shortages are things I think we need to explore further than we have to date.
So hold that thought for just a second. Let me just ask you, have the manufacturers been responsive?
Manufacturers understand this issue. We've been in close discussion with many of the manufacturing organizations, ISPE and PDA and other groups. They've identified these groups of longer-term shortages as things that we need to continue to talk about. Absolutely.
Dr. Cross talked about enforcement discretion, and you talked about exercise of regulatory flexibility. Can you give us some practical examples of where that exercise of regulatory flexibility, I mean, for example, the anesthetic drug propofol, has there been any, is there anywhere where regulatory flexibility may help in that particular shortage?
Let me give you a slightly different example, and then we can return to propofol if it isn't useful. But let's talk about total parenteral nutrition, or the nutritional supplements that were in critical shortage recently that are used in newborn infants, where it's really life or death for them to be able to get access to these medicines. Those products were in limited availability because the manufacturers are having a hard time producing enough sufficient materials. FDA expedited any and every review, expedited all of our inspectional activities to make certain that whatever the manufacturer was able to provide, we were able to make certain was available to serve the infants, the newborns, as quickly as possible. We've had other examples where particulates have been found, examples of drugs in shortage where particulates have, on surface, required cessation of manufacture, cessation of distribution of the product. Because of their critical nature, we worked with the manufacturers. We've worked to find filters that could be placed in line when that product is administered to the patient, allowing them to continue to be used even though there is this product defect, these particulates that exist. We've determined they have to be made available to the patients. We've worked with the manufacturers to make that happen. So
that has been successful. We'll talk about propofol, though, because I get a lot of questions about that. I mean, lack of an anesthetic, a reliable, safe anesthetic drug it's a big deal.
Absolutely. And propofol is a slightly different situation because there the issue is a large fraction of the propofol comes from outside the U.S. Well over 90% of the propofol is imported into the country, and there have been some concerns about importation as because of some use of propofol in unapproved uses. The FDA's interest, the focus that we've had, has been to make certain that the propofol is available for patients who are using it on label, as indicated, as you said, in outpatient settings for anesthesia and those things. So our work there has been to work with the sponsor to do anything we needed to make sure the patients received it when it was indicated for them. 5 million units dosages a month or something. It's an enormously important product that we're paying very close attention to.
Well, it's revolutionized outpatient surgery because of the recovery time is so abbreviated with that as opposed to the other compounds that were previously available in days gone by.
Absolutely, and we know that when in the past there was a propofol shortage a few years ago, and what we learned in that shortage was that when physicians moved from propofol to other products that they were less familiar with, mistakes occurred because they were not as familiar with the dosage and how to monitor patients and things like that. So making certain that that product is available is something that's very important for the U.S.
Just very briefly, I've heard anecdotally that difficulties getting proper amounts of Tamiflu during this last flu season, and that the cost for Tamiflu had really exponentially increased. Can you speak to that at all?
I haven't heard that the cost of Tamiflu has spiked. There are other increases in pricing that we have been hearing about, although that's not something that the FDA normally has a statutory authority over. And while there were some spot shortages with Tamiflu, we think at present we're able to produce the necessary amounts of Tamiflu necessary.
Thanks, Chairman. I have some additional questions I'll submit in writing, but I thank you for the courtesy.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize gentlelady from Virgin Islands, Dr. Christensen, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for this hearing today. While I'm very happy to hear that the drug shortages are reducing, as everyone has said, they still remain too high, and we know that rural areas, communities of color, territories like my district will be some of those where we will feel it the most when there is a drug shortage. I have a question that sort of digs a little deeper into my colleague from Tennessee, the Vice Chair's question, I think. And I'm asking both, I'll start with Dr. Throckmorton, but also ask Dr. Cross to comment. One of the explanations I've heard for the increase in drug shortages was that FDA was forcing manufacturers to come up with a state-of-the-art manufacturing practices, even though the old tried and true were completely adequate to ensure safety and effectiveness. The argument went that to meet the new standards, some companies had to shut down their lines to upgrade their facilities, resulting in the shortages. I've also heard something that's almost the opposite argument, that FDA had been telling some companies for years that their facilities were in decline and needed to be upgraded to avoid problems in the future, even though the facilities were currently meeting inspection standards, and eventually those warnings, unfortunately, came through. So, Dr. Throckmorton, can you comment on these two different perspectives? You mentioned in your testimony that FDA is trying to encourage industry to adopt new technologies, but at the same time that FDA is not raising the bar, and standards for existing appropriate technologies. That seems a very nuanced point. Could you just elaborate for me?
Absolutely. So there are a set of standards that are in place right now for manufacturing, for sort of quality manufacturing that we would expect a firm that's making propofol, a firm that's making a tablet form, whatever, a set of standards that they have in place that would guide the manufacture of a product so that it's sufficiently safe and efficacious and of quality manufacturing. Those things are working, and we're not changing those standards at all. What we also see is that there are more efficient ways to be manufacturing products, especially products that are very complicated, products that are like sterile injectables or products that are biologics, places where you want to use the state-of-the-art manufacturing processes. We've been working for over a decade now trying to identify those manufacturing processes to help guide drug manufacturing, and then make recommendations in the form of guidance in ways that manufacturers can look at to do better than the current. So we're not looking to change the current acceptable process practices. We're looking to find a way to incentivize a move towards a more efficient, a more continuous kinds of manufacturing that we think offers a lot of potential for preventing shortages by improving the overall quality of manufacturing.
Thank you. Dr. Cross, would you like to add anything?
Well, we too heard from industry the same concerns, and from FDA the same response. FDA has moved increasingly, and now under FDASIA explicitly is moving to a risk-based inspection decision-making process about which manufacturers they should be inspecting with which frequency. The drugs that are in shortage, the sterile injectables, are inherently risky in their manufacture, and so you would expect there to be a higher level of inspection of those facilities just because of the risk of the product. We, as part of the ongoing work I mentioned before, we are going to be looking at the pattern of inspections that FDA has had across the number of years of these facilities to see if we're seeing any change, because it was a concern raised to us by manufacturers. But the standards as posed in regulation and guidance have not changed.
Thank you. I have a number of other questions that I'll submit for the record, but I have a short one. Dr. Cross, GAO report doesn't focus on shortages of medically important drugs. Can you tell us how closely the shortage characteristics and trends provided in the report are likely to track with or predict those for medically important drugs? Is that something you can focus on in the future?
It tracks very closely. We did use a different data source. We used information from the University of Utah Drug Information System because they have had a database for much longer. And so we were able to look at trends across time. FDA didn't develop its database until 2011, and we wanted data that would go back to 2007. But the vast majority of the data that Utah posts are of medically necessary drugs. There's a very close alignment there. There's some differences in the way the FDA and Utah count the drugs, so the numbers may look different, even though you're talking about the same drug shortage.
And my time is up, so thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. And obviously a follow-up to the GAO report. A few comments before I begin. You know, we're never going to have enough money to do whatever we want to do, and more people and more money sometimes is just assumed that's going to make things better. But this really, it's important for me to always remember the whole budget pie. When 65% is mandatory spending, 35% is discretionary spending. If we don't get control of our mandatory spending, spending stays the same, discretionary keeps shrinking, which will affect all agencies, the military and the like. So in this budget debate, as people say, and we hear the discretionary part of the budget, we are ill-advised not to always talk about the problems of mandatory spending. I would also say that FDA was one of the few agencies that got additional money through these budgetary fights than a lot of other agencies. So with that, Sydney, can you put up this? Because a lot of the questions, I think, are pertaining to this that's in the GAO report. And I have it on, that's what I've been playing around with my iPad, trying to figure out everything that this chart says, but I think it's very illustrative, whether it's Marsha Blackburn or John Dingell. I think they've all been referring to this chart. And the dark blue is ongoing shortages which began in prior years. Now, I guess the first question I have is, so like in the 2000 you have 40, those don't always carry, some of those must fall off. Is that true? Dr. Cross?
Yes, that's true. It's not
cumulative.
It's not the same. It's not cumulative of all of them. Some drug shortages are resolved, and so they drop out. Those that have not been resolved by the end of the year roll over into our data for the next year.
And forgive me if I didn't read the report as closely as I should. From 2007 even until what's projected on the final bar chart, which isn't finished with the fiscal year, are there pending drugs that follow that whole time period?
I'm not aware of any that followed the entire time period. We do have some that have extended for 5 years. A very small number. Most drug shortages are resolved within 1 year or to 2 years, but there are a very small number of shortages that have continued across multiple years.
Thank you. Now, and so then the lighter blue portion is really kind of, Dr. Throckmorton, that's what you've been referring to, is the success has been made in the new shortages, right? So, and we see that on this chart, and that, Dr. Cross, you've concurred with that too. There is progress being made on that, as we can see from that pending chart, correct? And that's both in the testimony.
Yes, that's correct.
So I guess that's my kind of summation. I think this chart is very illustrative in the report and kind of highlighted what most people had talked about. I guess couple of years ago, when we've been having this debate, I always wondered why the market itself doesn't respond to alleviate these shortages based upon a price signal. Now, Dr. Burgess kind of mentioned, which Dr. Throckmorton, you may have dismissed, that there was a Tamiflu signal sent. I don't know that. You said you didn't know that. Why, in my minute left, is there something structurally about how we, or either the government in its coding, or its spending through Medicare and Medicaid, or the insurance applications of purchasing drugs, is there something that distorts the market signals for shortages?
I'm not sure. You know, we didn't really look at
Okay,
it
that's
that
fair.
way.
Maybe that's something, Mr. Chairman, to follow up with on another question in the future. Dr. Throckmorton, what do you think?
I think, as others have commented, economics have got to be playing a role in the decisions that the manufacturers are making here. I think we know less about that, at least speaking for myself, speaking for the FDA, than we might like to. But those are important.
But a lot of these shortages are low margin generic drugs too. So if they're very low margin, they're making a penny on whatever the application is, and that's hard to get a price signal on a return on a major. If you only have one plant operating full speed, producing all this product.
Dr. Burgess's propofol, others would remember better. Someone has said that the profit on a dose is in the tens of cents.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks. I appreciate what the gentleman from Illinois is asking, because I had a kind of high school reunion with some friends. A friend of mine's an emergency room physician in Auburn, Alabama, and he was telling me about the shortage of drugs, and he said it wasn't the expensive stuff, and he couldn't do his service properly sometimes because of that. And you know, classic price controls in economics. I'm not saying there's price controls, but when there's not ability to move the price for some reason, it's something to investigate, then you would say it's going to be shortage and quality. And that's the two things you mentioned, is shortage of ability and quality. And it seems there's not a price signal that the gentleman from Illinois to allow other people to enter. And we're not talking about even hundreds of dollars, $1,000. We're talking about sometimes cents and sometimes just dollars. And people aren't getting over that. But Dr. Cross, in your testimony you noted that FDA officials have told you that Fidesia's requirements that manufacturers notify the FDA in advance has helped the situation, that they're able to take some steps. But you also note that while FDA is planning to establish a new information system to track data, there are significant concerns, specifically that they're not conducting routine analysis of existing data, drug shortages, in the database to identify or respond proactively. Can you elaborate, or will you elaborate on what?
Yes, well, we did have concerns about what we call internal controls, the extent to which FDA was ensuring the accuracy of the information in their database, and then the extent to which they were doing broader analyses to look at such things as the ongoing shortages, as opposed to using it as a tool to help them track the status of an individual shortage. And so what we weren't seeing were those kinds of larger analyses looking at trends, and as time goes on and they have more fully developed data, we believe it's important for them to engage in that, and they've agreed with us that that is something that they plan to start doing now that they have a little more data for a little longer period of time. That is something that they can do. But you know, we do talk a little bit, to your earlier point about the kind of the economics. That is part of what we're trying to continue to look at. There have been issues raised to us, but no agreement on whether or not there's any one source of what's holding down those prices.
Okay, well, thanks. And so also, I noticed in 2011 the inspections were at their peak. FDA inspectors at their peak, and also the shortages were at their peak. Has GAO examined the correlation between inspections and drug shortages?
We haven't, and that is also part of what we're going to continue to look at, is to go and see if there was a change across time in inspections. But you know, as I noted before, these are high-risk products for the most part. Most of these are the sterile injectable drugs, and they're high-risk products where you would expect FDA to be going with some greater frequency to those facilities than to some place that's making, a tablet that's been in operation for a long time with a good safety record.
Okay, thanks. And then Dr. Throckmorton, drug shortages often require practitioners to utilize alternative treatments that may not be as effective. Does the FDA compile and disseminate information regarding alternative treatments in times of shortage for practitioners or patients?
We have typically left that to other groups, particularly the pharmacists and ASHP, for instance, with their website that Dr. Cross has been using for her data and things, do identify alternative uses. We're able to identify other drugs with the same indication, but we recognize that practice of medicine is such that people look for other alternative therapies that may or may not be on label, and so we tend to use take advantage of other people's expertise to have them do that for us.
Okay, thank you for that. And then, Dr. Cross, can GAO provide a more detail about FDA's regulatory actions to prevent or mitigate drug shortages, based on your discussions with agency staff as well as manufacturers? And bottom line, are FDA's actions or decisions being exercised consistently?
I don't know that I can speak to whether they're being exercised consistently. We certainly can provide you with some additional detail on what actions they've taken.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here today and answering these questions. I would be remiss to not remind everybody that drug shortages, particularly of sterile injectables, led to some healthcare providers feeling dependent on the supposedly sterile compounded drugs that ultimately led to the fungal meningitis outbreak in 2012 that killed 64 Americans, including 2 in my area. Because these drugs were more difficult to obtain, illegal manufacturers that called themselves compounding pharmacies like NECC entered the market to fill the need of hospitals and outpatient clinics for sterile injectables. Thankfully, Congress put FDA on notice with FDASIA to deal with the drug shortages, much like Congress did with the Drug Quality and Security Act with large-scale compounding and illegal manufacturing. FDA officials have signaled that the agency has begun to identify signals to better predict quality issues at manufacturing facilities. Dr. Throckmorton, can you comment on these improvements?
Mostly to say that we understand the importance of getting that right. So identifying what those metrics are and then having a discussion about how they would be used is very important. And so part of our ongoing efforts this coming year and beyond are to speak with manufacturing experts that can talk about the kinds of measures that a plant uses to follow their own manufacturing quality, understand those things better, and then talk about how a purchaser might make use of those kinds of information.
And I appreciate that. And one of the concerns that I had was that it appeared in that fungal meningitis outbreak that the lawyers at FDA were not using all the powers that were available to them to oversee. And while we don't want too much oversight that stops manufacturers who are doing the right things from producing their product, I'm hopeful that the lawyers are being more aggressive if they see something that looks like it's out of line, because while we want to have a good supply, we want to have a safe supply as well. Would you not agree with that? And do you think the lawyers are being a little more aggressive post the outbreak of the fungal meningitis problem?
I would absolutely agree. We need to do anything we can to assure a safe supply.
All right. Dr. Cross, GAO recommended that the FDA improve its databases so the agency can employ more predictive analysis to its preventive activities. How did the agency respond to this critique, and how far off are they from putting your recommendations into practice?
FDA agreed with our recommendations, and my understanding is they are beginning to do it immediately.
All right. Also, the GAO report found that the FDA lacked policies, procedures, and specific training materials related to management and use of its existing drug shortage database. What impact does this have on the agency's ability to use this database to prevent or mitigate shortages?
Well, we think they do need to have these kinds of standard procedures in place to assure the accuracy of the data and the understanding on the part of their staff of exactly how data should be entered and how it should be analyzed. They also agreed that they would move forward on those steps.
I appreciate that. What role do you think this database could play in addressing future drug shortages?
Well, we think it's important for the agency to have good information because they need to be able to look at this more broadly, to look within classes, to look across time, to to be able to measure whether or not they're putting the right steps in place and having the kind of impact to improve the situation, rather than treating these as each individual kinds of situations that have to uniquely be solved.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Elmers, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here today. In my district, this is a very specific situation that I'm hearing from all of my hospitals. In particular, I'll focus on Wake Med Hospital System. They're an 870-bed healthcare system with multiple facilities around Raleigh, North Carolina. They basically deal with the three primary vendors for IV infusions. And all three have experienced quality manufacturing issues as well as holiday production shutdowns that contributed to the shortage. Wake Med's pharmacy spent an additional $80,000 in January to stock up on the drugs in anticipation. I appreciate the efforts of the FDA to address the shortage, but it appears that they're only addressing the symptoms and not the real causes. I'm also concerned about the Medicare reimbursement system, especially the explosion of the 340B discounts is reducing margins for generic manufacturers. This is pushing them to stop producing low-cost generic injectables, just like the system is driving community cancer clinics into hospitals. It also appears that these manufacturers simply don't have the margins to invest in their manufacturing plants, which is why we see many of the quality problems. My question has to do with what is and how are we addressing these issues right now. I want to focus my questions today on the FDA's work with the industry to make sure everyone is working together to find solutions. Dr. Throckmorton, there remains virtually no transparency in the process for how drugs that make it onto the shortage list ultimately get off this list. How does the agency decide that a product is no longer in shortage, and is there a consistent and standardized formula for FDA uses to produce a product from the shortage list?
Thank you. The short answer is yes. We do have a consistent process that we use to apply to drugs to decide when they come onto the shortage list and when a shortage is no longer existing and they can come off it. Our focus is on determining whether or not patients in the U.S. can get the treatments that they need. So it's not focused on product by product shortage. So there may be a shortage of a buffered aspirin because one manufacturer of a kind of buffered aspirin may no longer be manufacturing, but there may be 4 other kinds of aspirin that are available. That will not be a shortage from our perspective because the other products can and will ramp up. That's something our people know about. Talk with those other manufacturers. We're able to assess using prescription data, using other data that we have access to. We can determine whether those other manufacturers can fill in for that manufacturer that's made a decision to not manufacture or needed to stop manufacturing to improve a plant or improve a product line. That's slightly different than the kinds of data that the University of Utah counts, the data that Dr. Cross is referring to. We're looking at the totality of the data, the availability of a given therapy, not an individual product. And so our numbers are slightly different than ASHP that the University of Utah have. We believe fundamentally ours reflect the availability of the therapy for the patients, which is our public health goal, if you will. But behind that, we have a process in place to determine when available production is not able to meet demand, and then work with manufacturers, and when production returns and is once again able to meet demand, to take something off of the shortage list.
Okay. Also, very specifically, there again, Dr. Throckmorton, the FDA's inspection of API can remain a barrier, and ANDA holder can market the generic drug. How has the agency tried to improve its record on this issue to ensure that the ANDA holders can market a drug and potentially address a drug shortage?
So 2 parts to that answer. The first part would be some of the actions that we've already talked about, the expedited reviews and some of the expedited inspections that the FDA has been able to do, particularly in shortage situations. There's a second, longer term, and it relates to the passage of GDUFA. So the Generics Drugs User Fee Act has provided us additional resources and additional opportunity to sort of balance the playing field, if you will, so that we're able to devote the resources we need to the generics market, which 85% of the U.S. drug market is generics now. We're able to allocate the resources that we need to that area to make certain they're getting the inspectional attention, the compliance history, the reviews from our reviewers that they need to. So that's an important addition for us.
Thank you so much, and I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. That concludes the questions of the members who are present. We'll have additional questions we'll send to you in writing. If you would please respond promptly. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and members should submit their questions by the close of business on Tuesday, February 25th. Thank you very much for the testimony, the good information, and we look forward to continue to work with you. With that, without objection, subcommittee is adjourned.